They said, "No singing in this courtroom." But Elvis Presley wasn't just a singer. He was a man on trial for who he'd become. When the judge ordered him to stay silent, he did something no one expected, and the sound that followed changed how America saw him. Forever. Memphis, Tennessee, June 12, 1970. The air inside Shelby County Courthouse felt heavier than the Mississippi heat outside. Ceiling fans turned slow, like they were afraid to interrupt what was about to happen. Reporters filled the benches, their cameras aimed at a single wooden door. When it finally opened, the room didn't breathe. It gasped. Elvis Presley stepped through wearing a dark navy suit instead of his rhinestone jumpsuit. His hair, perfectly shaped, caught the sunlight leaking through tall windows. Outside, through the cracked glass, the crowd of nearly 800 fans chanted his name in waves that reached the courtroom walls. But today wasn't a concert. It was a hearing about a scuffle that broke out at Graceland a few months earlier. A bodyguard protecting him, a fan hurt, a lawsuit born from confusion. On paper, it was just a civil case. In truth, it was the king himself standing before the law, trying to prove he was still human. The bailiff called, "All rise." The judge, a square-shouldered man named Charles Renner, entered with the gravity of a man who'd seen every kind of trouble, except this. He adjusted his glasses, looked over the room, then fixed his eyes on Elvis. "Elvis Aaron Presley," he said, voice echoing. "You will speak only when asked, and there will be no performances in this courtroom." Understood. Every reporter wrote the line instantly. No performances, no singing. The words landed like a door slamming shut. Elvis nodded once, polite, quiet, but a faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. No one knew whether it was nerves or irony. For a man who lived through screams of 20,000 people a night, being told to be silent was almost cruel. He sat beside his lawyer, folded his hands and stared at the judge's gavel, a symbol of final control. The sound of shuffling papers became the soundtrack of his stillness. You could almost hear the crowd outside holding its breath. A reporter whispered, "He looks calm." Another replied, "He's waiting for the cue." But the cue never came. Halfway through testimony, a fan's muffled cry slipped through an open window. "We love you, Elvis!" Heads turned. The judge frowned. For a second, the king's eyes softened, like he could feel every person waiting outside. Then he lowered his gaze again, obedient. Inside him, something shifted. He wasn't angry. He was aching, because for years, people had mistaken his songs for rebellion, when most were just prayers wrapped in rhythm. When Renner banged the gavel to quiet the room, Elvis's jaw tightened. He'd promised respect. But deep down, a storm gathered, not of pride, but of conviction. If he couldn't speak truth here, could he still sing it later? And what did silence mean to a man whose whole life was sound? The clock on the wall ticked too loudly. The scent of old wood and sweat filled the space. It was a courtroom, yet somehow it felt like a confessional. As closing arguments began, Elvis looked down at his cufflinks. Tiny silver lightning bolts, engraved with the initials TCB, taking care of business. They caught the light, flashing like reminders of the man he used to be. And then he glanced toward the judge again, smile returning, faint but certain. Because even though every rule in that room said don't perform, Elvis had already decided that when the doors opened again, when he faced the world outside, he would answer in the only language he truly knew. Music. The gavel struck once more, ending the session. Reporters rushed for the exit. The crowd's chanting grew louder, spilling into the marble halls. Elvis stood, buttoned his jacket, and whispered to his lawyer, "Guess the show's not over yet." He stepped toward the sunlight, toward hundreds of waiting voices, and toward the moment that would turn a courtroom reprimand into history. What would you have done if the world told you to stop being yourself? Would you obey or find another way to speak? Before that courtroom morning, there was Vegas, February 1970, the International Hotel. 2,200 people packed into the neon-lit showroom, Cameras flashing, sequins burning under stage lights. Elvis had just launched his comeback residency, and every night the crowd left in tears. But backstage was a different story. He'd sit alone after shows, the rhinestones still glowing on his white jumpsuit, the room quiet except for the sound of a flickering bulb and the faint hum of the casino below. His old friend and bodyguard, Red West, once said he'd stare at the floor for minutes, like he was still hearing ghosts. Ghosts of what he'd lost. His family breaking apart. Friends turning distant. Critics calling him a nostalgia act. Fame had made him a king, but it also built a golden cage. And inside that cage, silence hurt more than noise. Elvis had started writing things down. Lines that looked like lyrics but felt more like confessions. One note read, "They love the voice, not the man." Another, "If I stop singing, who am I?" Those papers were never meant for anyone to see. A hotel maid later sold a few pages to a collector. The ink was faded, but the ache was still loud. So when Judge Renner told him no singing in this courtroom, it wasn't just a rule, it was a wound reopened. For Elvis, being told to stay silent was like asking him to stop breathing. What no one saw that morning was the emotional weight he carried through those courthouse doors. Not arrogance, sorrow, not anger, exhaustion. He had sung before presidents, before millions, yet inside he felt unheard. In those quiet minutes, as the lawyers argued, his mind wasn't in Memphis. It was back on stage, in the middle of In the Ghetto, when the spotlight dimmed and the audience's cheers turned into a hush so deep it felt holy. That hush had meaning. It was connection, understanding. The courtroom silence felt nothing like that. Here, silence was control, a reminder that even the king could be ordered to kneel before the law. Red West later said he didn't care about the case. He cared that somebody told him to shut up. And that was it. The pivot, the invisible crack forming in his composure. He looked down at his hands on the defense table, the same hands that once held a microphone in front of a million flashing bulbs. They looked empty now, still, too still. Outside, reporters described him as reserved. But those who knew him could tell, restraint was his warning sign. Every time Elvis went quiet, something was building. It wasn't defiance this time. It was faith. Because deep down, he believed a voice, any voice, could carry light into dark places, and he wasn't about to let one man's gavel erase that truth. That's why, when the session finally ended and the crowd roared his name again, Elvis didn't rush to his car. He stood there for a moment, head bowed, as if he was listening to something only he could hear. A melody forming in his chest, a promise taking shape, and the next time he opened his mouth, it wouldn't be in defiance, it would be in peace. June 12th, 1970, 10:47 a.m. The second day of testimony began with thunder rolling outside Memphis. Inside the Shelby County Courthouse, the lights buzzed faintly. Reporters whispered that the storm sounded like a drum roll for whatever was about to unfold. Elvis sat still in his seat, his tie straight, his eyes calm but distant. Across from him, Judge Charles Renner tapped a pen against the desk. Every sound echoed, the scrape of chairs, the shuffle of legal papers, even the heartbeat of the room. Everyone expected drama. What they didn't expect was grace. When a witness mentioned his name too loudly, the crowd at the back gasped. The judge pounded the gavel. "Quiet," he barked. "This is not a show." A thin smile crossed Elvis's lips. Not mockery, something gentler, almost pity. Renner adjusted his glasses again. "Mr. Presley," he said, "you understand my order. There will be no performances here." Elvis nodded. "Yes, sir." His voice was low, steady, polite. But then he leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Your Honor, may I say one thing?" The courtroom froze. The judge hesitated, then nodded. Elvis didn't rise. He just looked down, speaking softly. "I came here out of respect, not to make noise. But sometimes silence says the wrong thing." Renner frowned, unsure what to do with that. Then it happened, so quietly that even the stenographer nearly missed it. Elvis closed his eyes and hummed a single note. One pure note. A low Amen, carried more by breath than sound. The walls seemed to hold it for a second before letting it go. No one moved. Reporters looked at each other, pencils frozen. A woman in the back started crying. Even Renner's hand hovering over the gavel began to tremble. He struck it down once. Bang! Mr. Presley, that's enough. Elvis opened his eyes, calm again. Yes, sir, no argument, no rebellion, just that single word, soft as prayer. But the air had changed. The silence that followed wasn't control anymore. It was reverence. A local journalist later wrote, it was as if the whole city took a breath at once. Renner cleared his throat, pretending nothing had happened. But the damage, or maybe the healing when was done. The king had obeyed the rule, and still he'd broken it completely, because that one note said what 1,000 testimonies couldn't. That art and spirit can't be contained by walls or titles. Red West, sitting behind him, whispered later to a reporter, he didn't do it to show off. He did it because he needed to remind himself who he was. And maybe the judge knew that too. When the session ended, Renner didn't look at him as a defendant anymore, but as a man who'd turned obedience into poetry. Outside, the storm had passed. Sunlight hit the courthouse windows, scattering bright reflections across the floor. Elvis stood, adjusted his jacket, and looked back at the bench. For a split second, the two men locked eyes. Law and legend, order and freedom, and something unspoken passed between them. The gavel came down one last time, court adjourned. But everyone there knew the real performance hadn't even begun, because the moment he stepped outside, with the crowd waiting and the tape recorders ready, that quiet amen would grow into something no courtroom could contain. Sometimes rebellion doesn't roar, sometimes it whispers. The doors swung open to a wall of sound. 800 voices, maybe more, pressed against the courthouse steps on Adams Avenue. Cameras clicked like thunder. Reporters shouted questions, but no one could hear a word. They were waiting for one thing. Him. Elvis stepped into the light, blinking against the afternoon glare. The rain from earlier had left the air heavy and shining. His lawyer whispered, "Straight to the car, sir." But he didn't move, because down those stone steps, through the sea of bodies and homemade signs, he saw one girl, 14-year-old Lydia McCarty, holding a cardboard sign painted in crooked blue letters. "Sing for us." Elvis will listen. That stopped him cold. A breeze lifted the edges of the sign, and for a second, it looked like it was waving him on. He reached up, loosened his tie, and walked toward the crowd. Flashbulbs exploded. Reporters surged forward. A policeman started shouting, "Mr. Presley, please!" But Elvis raised a hand. Calm, gentle. The noise dropped to a murmur, then to silence. He stood on the courthouse steps, eyes closed, face lifted toward the pale sun. And then he began to sing. No band, no microphone, just a single steady voice cutting through the Tennessee heat. "Well, I'm tired and so weary, but I must go along. Peace in the Valley, the same hymn his mother loved. The same one he'd promised to never perform for money again." People froze. Reporters lowered their cameras. The crowd turned from noise to stillness. A city holding its breath. Every word echoed off courthouse stone, circling back in a soft halo of sound. He sang with no swagger, no pose, just a man, stripped of glitter and fame, standing where the law had tried to quiet him. A little boy near the front whispered, "Mama, that's Elvis." And she whispered back, "Not today, baby." "That's Grace." The judge, still inside, heard it through the window. He didn't call security. He just sat, eyes closed, hands folded, letting the voice roll over him. Reporters described it later like something supernatural. One wrote, "It was louder than thunder but softer than rain." Another. You could hear him breathe between notes, and somehow that was the part that broke you. A TV crew from Channel 3 caught 15 seconds of it on grainy black and white film. The footage still exists. The tape hissed like static around Holiness. When the song ended, Elvis didn't bow. He didn't speak. He just smiled at the crowd, a tired, kind smile, and said quietly, "Thank you." The silence that followed was almost frightening. Then someone began to clap. Another joined. Then hundreds. The cheer rose like a wave, echoing down Main Street, spilling into the afternoon. A policeman tried to open the car door for him, but Elvis shook his head. He took a scarf from his pocket, a simple white square, and handed it to Lydia. "Keep it safe," he said. "It's yours now." That scarf would later end up in a glass case at the Memphis Music Museum. Labeled only "Courthouse Scarf, June 12, 1970. For days, the city couldn't stop talking about what happened. Churches replayed the moment during sermons. Radio hosts described it as the song that silenced the city. And that night, when the footage hit the evening news, viewers across America saw something rare, a man using faith instead of fame. Letters poured into Graceland by the hundreds. One read, "You reminded us what music is supposed to do." Lydia's mother kept the sign. Years later, she told a reporter, "It wasn't about a song. It was about a man asking to be heard and hearing us back." What happens when a performer stops chasing applause and starts chasing peace? Maybe that's when art becomes something higher. As the crowd finally thinned, Elvis lingered at the top of the steps. The sun had dropped low, turning the courthouse gold. He looked up at the windows where the judge had been, almost like he was saying goodbye. Then he whispered, "Amen," one last time. The cameras caught it, barely audible, almost lost in the wind. But everyone who was there swore they heard it, a word so small it could fit inside silence, yet somehow filled the whole city. By nightfall, the story had already outrun Memphis. That 15-second clip of Elvis singing on the courthouse steps hit the airwaves just after midnight. CBS Evening News called it an unexpected act of grace. Across America, living rooms fell silent as people watched the king of rock and roll, not in a glittering suit, but in a dark courthouse doorway, singing a hymn. In Los Angeles, radio hosts replayed the sound again and again. One DJ whispered, "You can hear the street traffic behind him, like heaven and earth sharing the same breath." Within 24 hours, newspapers in New York, Chicago, and London carried the headline, "Elvis breaks the law with a prayer." And that's exactly how people remembered it. Not as rebellion, but as redemption. Church choirs in Tennessee began rehearsing Peace in the Valley again, decades after it had faded from their songbooks. A pastor from Tupelo told his congregation, "If faith can stand outside a courthouse and sing, maybe hope ain't lost yet." Even Judge Renner couldn't escape it. Reporters caught him outside the courthouse 3 days later, refusing interviews, hiding behind dark glasses. But a week after that, someone slipped a check under the door of the Memphis Children's Hospital, unsigned, for $25,000. The handwriting matched the judge's. When asked about it years later, a clerk remembered his only comment. "He reminded me that mercy has a sound." For Elvis, the world's reaction was both a miracle and a warning. Fame had turned him into a headline again. But this time, not for scandal, not for excess, not for another broken heart, for something purer, something honest. Still, part of him feared it was just another wave that would fade. He told Red West quietly one night, "They're calling it history." "I just wanted to do the right thing," Red said. "You did." That's why it worked. But it wasn't over yet. Fan mail tripled in 2 weeks. Children wrote letters saying they'd started singing hymns in school talent shows. Veterans said they hadn't prayed in years until they heard that voice on TV. One note, signed only Lydia M., the same girl from the courthouse, read, "Thank you for hearing me. I'll remember that day for the rest of my life." He kept that letter. folded it once, tucked it in his Bible. When reporters asked what he'd learned from the whole thing, he just said, "You don't have to shout to be heard." Behind that simple answer was something deeper. A man who'd finally learned that his greatest power wasn't the roar of applause. It was the hush that came after. The world saw a protest. He saw a prayer answered. And while the country moved on to the next headline, Memphis didn't. For months, fans gathered on those courthouse steps every Sunday evening, candles in hand, singing softly into the warm air. A small brass plaque was added to the wall years later. No fanfare, no ceremony, just an inscription. In memory of the day, music met mercy, June 12, 1970. Elvis visited it once, quietly, years before his death. A guard said he stood there for almost 10 minutes, just looking at the metal glinting in the sun. Then he turned and said, "That's all I ever wanted it to mean." Sometimes history doesn't come from a stage or a spotlight. Sometimes it's born from one note, sung at the right moment, for the right reason. 6 months later, the roar of Las Vegas felt different. The marquee outside the International Hotel still flashed Elvis Presley, Live Tonight. But inside, something had changed. The king, who once opened with blue suede shoes, now began every show with a single word whispered into the mic. Amen. It wasn't planned by promoters. It wasn't on the set list. But every night, before the horns kicked in and the spotlight hit his face, Elvis stood still and sang a short gospel verse, sometimes Peace in the Valley, sometimes How Great Thou Art. The audience, thousands strong, would fall silent. Candles replaced lighters. Tears replaced cheers. Backstage, managers panicked. People came to rock, not to pray, one said. Elvis just smiled. "They'll listen," he replied. They always do. He wasn't chasing rebellion anymore. He was chasing meaning. That courthouse moment had stripped something away. The noise, the fear, the image. What was left was a man trying to give something real back to the people who never stopped believing in him. He called it the Walk in Peace Tour. Every concert opened with gospel and closed with gratitude. He'd thanked the crowd for letting me be human. Critics didn't know what to do with it. Some mocked it. Others called it the second coming of the king. But fans felt it. That warmth that used to fill the Vegas showroom now traveled farther, softer, deeper. In April 1972, inside RCA Studio B in Nashville, he recorded He Touched Me. Producers said his voice that night sounded different, worn, raw, full of quiet power. When he finished the final take, no one spoke for almost a minute. Then the engineer whispered, "That's it." The record would win him his first Grammy. Not for rock, not for pop, for gospel. Reporters asked him later if the award mattered. He said, "It's not a trophy. It's proof the good Lord still hears me." Red West noticed it most. He stopped fighting the world, he told a friend. He started talking to it. Elvis began donating quietly to hospitals and churches around Memphis. No press, no cameras. He sent instruments to schools, paid off debts for struggling families, even funded a youth choir under Lydia McCarty's name, the girl with the courthouse sign. Her mother cried when she got the letter from EP with thanks. Something inside him had shifted for good. He still wore the jumpsuits, still lit up Vegas, but underneath the rhinestones was something gentler, almost preacher-like. During a show in '73, he told the crowd, "I don't sing to be famous anymore. I sing to remember who I am." And that night, when he reached the line, "You touch me, and I am no longer the same," his voice cracked. The audience didn't cheer. They whispered. They could feel it, because by then, everyone knew. This wasn't about the king taking the stage. It was about the man finding his soul again. Each tour stop felt more like a revival than a concert. Fans brought hymn books instead of posters. Ushers said the shows smelled like church, perfume, sweat and candles, behind all the lights and applause. Elvis had finally learned something the courtroom tried to teach him. True power isn't in volume, it's in conviction. When the music faded, he'd walk backstage, towel over his shoulders, and say softly, "That's enough for tonight." No encore, no crowd chase, just peace. And in that quiet, that beautiful, earned quiet, he seemed to find the thing fame had stolen from him years ago: stillness. Maybe that's what transformation really is. Not changing who you are, but returning to it. Years later, the courthouse looked smaller, the paint had faded, and the marble steps were cracked from decades of rain. But if you stood still on Adams Avenue at sunset, you could almost hear it, a faint echo of that voice that once rose against the silence. June 12th, 1970, people still remembered. Every anniversary, a few locals gathered there. No cameras, no news vans, just candles, small radios, and soft hymns. Some brought old vinyl records, others yellowed newspaper clippings. One woman, grey-haired now, always placed a white scarf on the steps. Her name? Lydia McCarty. She kept that courthouse scarf all her life. Said it still smelled faintly of cologne and rain. When the city restored the Shelby County Courthouse in 1995, workers found something wedged deep in the stone cracks. A folded, water-stained note sealed in plastic. On it, written in faded blue ink, "For whoever finds this, don't let the world silence what's good in you." Signed simply, EP. The discovery made local headlines for one day, then disappeared into memory. But a week later, a small brass plaque appeared near the main entrance. No one claimed credit for it. It read, "In memory of the day music met mercy, June 12th, 1970. Tour guides still stop there. They tell visitors about the day the king disobeyed politely. How one note of faith turned a courtroom into a cathedral. Some tourists laugh, some tear up, but every now and then, someone stands in the exact spot where he sang and just listens." Inside the courthouse, if you walk up the stairwell, you'll see a tiny smudge on the wall, the place where his hand brushed against it as he walked out. The janitor who found it never cleaned it off. "Some marks," he said, "ain't dirt. They're memory." Over the years, that story became legend. Bootleg tapes circulated. Fans argued if the footage was real. But those who lived in Memphis didn't care about proof. They felt it, because sometimes the truest things leave no evidence, only echoes. And when Elvis passed away in 1977, people returned to those courthouse steps again. They brought flowers, candles, vinyl sleeves. Someone set up an old tape recorder and played "Peace in the Valley." The sound bounced off the same stone pillars that had once trapped him in silence. This time, the silence bowed back. A fan club in Mississippi still gathers every June 12th. They call it the Amen Day. No concerts, no impersonators, just people singing softly, together. Maybe that's what he left behind. Not just music, but mercy. Not just fame, but faith. The king of rock and roll turned a moment of humiliation into harmony, a command into compassion. He didn't defy the judge. He redefined obedience, and if you stand there today, by that brass plaque glowing in the late sun, you can still feel what he gave them. Not rebellion, not performance. Peace. Sometimes the world will try to quiet your voice. When it does, remember Elvis. Standing on those courthouse steps, singing not to prove a point, but to prove his heart still worked. Share this story with someone who's been told to stay silent, because some songs are meant to be sung, even in a courtroom.